I want to catch up on a few things about the Stephan Sterns case that I haven't really talked about. All this crazy multitude of motions. All this crazy amount of motions that Stephan Sterns' defense team are putting through. I want us to pretend to be like the judge and see which motions you would strike down, which ones you would deny, and which ones you would approve or half deny, half approve. I'm just pulling out the highlights. I am not going through every single, 55 motions or whatever. And I also want to talk to you about what I'm calling the missing interview with this guy, Chase Leonard. He's interviewed with a couple of YouTubers. I'm going to put their links below. Great interview. He calls himself a man who was as close as Stephan's brother. So I keep looking for Chase Leonard's interview with police and I don't see it. I want to cover a little bit what he told the YouTubers and what we can potentially expect Chase to say if he ever testifies on the stand. And we'll talk about the reasons perhaps why the police may not have interviewed Chase. And let's talk about the smoke that Stephan Sterns' attorneys have for YouTubers and TikTokers. All these motions, oh my goodness, but I'm just pulling out the highlights or the motions that made me angry or those that are kind of like, oh yeah, that's probably standard. I'm not a lawyer, but some lawyers out there are saying it's standard, and some stuff that's really, yeah, that could fly. So not everything is so egregious. But first of all, let's talk about this motion to continue in Stephan Sterns' CSAM case, the horrible, horrific case. Both of them are horrible and horrific. But like we predicted, it shows an impact of Stephan and when we will see him in court the next time, which probably won't be in 4 days? It probably won't be February 12th or whenever he was scheduled. Maybe that pretrial conference will still be scheduled. It is scheduled for February 12th, 2025 at 9 a.m. Now, will they still hold that conference? I don't know, but his trial for sure is not starting in February. There's this motion to continue. It shows that the pretrial conference is scheduled to be heard on February 12th. However, his lawyers, as expected, are saying there's additional time they need in order to prepare this case for trial. The initial set of depositions, which we kind of covered, I mentioned at the end of my previous video, they're scheduled initially for March 4th, 2025. So that's how I knew, okay, this guy's trial is not starting in February. It says an evidence viewing is scheduled for March 24th, 2025. How horrific that evidence and that CSAM case must be. These are the times I'm glad I'm just a YouTube presenter and not a person who has to view that kind of evidence. But God bless the people that do view that type of evidence, especially the ones who are seeking justice for Madeline Soto. Maddie Soto, she was only 13 years old. She was reported missing on February 26, 2024. Eventually, her mother's boyfriend, Stephan Sterns, was arrested and charged with her murder and all these other horrific crimes against her. He's finally, hopefully, going to trial, perhaps sometime this year, 2025. It says the remaining set of depositions are scheduled in the CSAM trial for April 10th, 2025. The defense has filed several motions to suppress that are pending, I'm sure, and a speedy trial in this case has been waived. It says they're filing this motion in good faith and not for the purpose of delay. I do believe them there. Remember, cops said they found a crazy amount of horrific photos. Stephan Sterns allegedly had this folder, Madeline, on his Google Drive somewhere that contained at least 1,700 images, videos, I don't know the breakdown, of Maddie alone. And then on other external drives or what have you, they found 35,000 images, perhaps videos too, of other children. Imagine all of that evidence to cover. They say the state does not object to this motion to continue, and the defense would request this case be set for a status date as to the scheduling of the defense's pending motions hearing. They're going to need a lot of motions hearings, as many motions as his defense team is putting in. Or they want a pre-trial conference date that would allow for the completion of these items. That's from Melissa Vickers. She is the one writing so many of these motions. Now, flipping over to Stephan Sterns' murder case, the motion that angered me the most the one I pray and hope in Jesus that the judge strikes it down right away and denies this motion. A motion for closure of all pre-trial proceedings. So it's saying Stephan Sterns, basically he's trying to move the court to enter an order to close all pre-trial proceedings to the press and the public. This is where they come for YouTubers and TikTokers, all of us who have been like on this case every day, ever since we heard of Madeline being missing. I think she is emblematic and a symbol of so many children who have just been treated horribly, who have lost their lives at the hands of predators. And I think she represents this symbolic victim. And I think so many people can relate to her, unfortunately, because they went through some of the same treatment she's gone through, obviously, and it's just, some people are just attached to this case. So Stephan's lawyers are saying this case has been the subject of unprecedented and highly prejudicial publicity. So, already they're saying, okay, you YouTubers, you TikTokers, you're doing too much. I guess we're supposed to treat Stephan Sterns with kid gloves. We're supposed to treat him like Jennifer Soto treats him and, cry about him and not cry about Maddie. And, we're supposed to really want him to get a lawyer ASAP, like Jennifer Soto, his on-again, off-again girlfriend, requested him to have through his dad as soon as allegedly she found out what he had done to her own little daughter. Not gonna happen. Anyway, Stephan's case is the subject of unprecedented and highly prejudicial publicity and media attention in Osceola County, adjacent areas of Osceola County, and a majority of the state of Florida and outside the state of Florida. Sure, true. At every court proceeding, however minor or inconsequential, there has been extensive coverage by the press as well as social media users on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, now called X, and Facebook. Well, I wouldn't call any of his hearings inconsequential or minor. People are following this case closely because they want to make sure at every step of the way Maddie gets her justice. I don't like cases that are hidden behind, no press can come in here. I understand it in terms of protecting the victims, of course. I hate to think of what happened to Abby and Libby in the Delphi case and how, yes, there was a crime scene photo that was leaked that should never have been leaked. The same thing happened apparently in Maddie's case. I do think it was a mistake when that Sheriff Lopez accidentally published on Instagram in a gallery a photo of the crime scene with Maddie. We don't want that kind of stuff to happen. So I understand that aspect of keeping the cameras out, keeping the cameras away from evidence like that, of course. But I don't consider any appearances minor or inconsequential with Stephan appearing in court. We want to see due process. We want him to have his due process. We want him to have a great defense so he can be convicted, if guilty, fairly and squarely, without saying, ineffective counsel, or without being able to reverse his conviction. The lawyers go on to say it is anticipated that the press will continue to be active and aggressive in the coverage of all events and proceedings in this case. You darn right we will, because I hate cases that are just hidden from the public, like the Delphi case. Okay, no cameras were allowed in the courtroom. I understand it to a degree. You want the victims to be protected, of course. However, certain cases, when they're not shown on television, it's almost like they didn't happen. We don't really know exactly what happened in the courtroom. Of course, we can rely on reporters to come out and tweet and give their impressions of what happened, but it feels like almost like the case isn't even happening. If we can't watch it streamed somewhere on Law and Crime or Court TV and just see and hear everything that's said, we do it because we want to make sure this case isn't forgotten. A lot of times, sometimes when stuff is kind of just hidden away, I feel like that's when injustice can happen because no one's really paying attention. Of course, it can happen in the O.J. Simpson trial with all those cameras watching, but I'd rather have things on camera than not be on camera. Now, the lawyers are trying to make it seem like they're protecting minor witnesses. It says, included in these discussions of Mr. Sterns' evidence will be Mr. Sterns' statements to the police, the medical examiner's findings, and potentially discussions on evidence related to statements from minor children. I'm like, come on. Do you care really about the minor child who was the victim of Stephan Sterns? I understand what they're saying. We hate that Mr. Sterns is taking it this far so that minor children, their statements have to be included. But we know how this can be done. For example, we've seen other cases where, of course, if minor children are anywhere on the stand, the cameras will not show that minor child. The camera will simply give you the voice of the child to see what they're saying. They are valuable, vital witnesses, especially in a case like this where Maddie told her friends things or her friends witnessed certain things, behaviors that no one else did. So I'm kind of like, don't make it seem like you really care. Oh, we don't want those cameras in there because we got to protect the minor children or their statements or whatever. Yeah, what about the minor child at the center of this crime case? Anyway, they went on to say public dissemination of these items of evidence will prevent Mr. Sterns from receiving a fair trial. No. How can public dissemination of the evidence prevent Stephan Sterns from receiving a fair trial? I get it. You don't want this crazy mob of people coming after him, but just let the evidence speak for itself. The public can disseminate the evidence laid out. That doesn't mean he's not getting a fair trial if the public knows the evidence. Public discussion in the press in the form of news stories, polls, letters to editors, and editorials will lead to an environment which will preclude Mr. Sterns from being afforded a fair trial in Osceola County and most of the state of Florida. No, like I always say, there's a billion people out there who pay no attention to true crime who can be called as valuable jury members and give their opinions based on the evidence and just give a fair ruling. So, counsel for Mr. Sterns feels there is no suitable alternative measure to protect Mr. Sterns' right to a fair trial under the U.S. and Florida constitutions other than closure of all pretrial hearings. Nope. I hope the judge denies this motion in full, with the only caveat being, of course, extra protection for minor statements. Pre-trial hearings, will any minors appear there or just their audio interviews? Okay, protect the children. We've redacted children's names. We know to take extra steps on how to protect minors. That's nothing new in the court system. So no, just keep the cameras there. In fact, they're talking about all these cameras that are on Mr. Sterns, all this attention on Mr. Sterns. Well, it turns out the Osceola Gazette was the only one apparently to get a photo of Mr. Sterns when he showed up that day, the only time he showed up in court, and it was a photo from far away. They act like, reporters are tripping over each other in the courtroom. We only got one photo of him, so strike that down. Now this motion I can understand. Motion in limine to prohibit reference during trial testimony to the, quote, victim's murder or the murder scene. So this is just semantics to me. I looked it up. Google AI says homicide is a general term for the killing of a person, while murder is a specific type of homicide that involves intent to kill. So to me, it's like, whatever. He's charged with first-degree murder, so he's already charged with, that's the name of the charge. Like they're going to say there's no charge for homicide. There is no crime of homicide here. But anyway, his attorney is saying, look, they don't want people saying the victim's murder or the murder scene, even though the state has filed a notice of intent to seek the penalty of death on June 7th, 2024. The state wants to put Sterns down for all these crimes he's accused of against Maddie. So the defense objects to any witness reference to murder or to the murder scene. The proper terminology that ought to be used instead is homicide. So fine, whatever. If I were a judge, maybe it'd be like, fine, get that. You give them that, whatever, defense. You want that? fine, take homicide, technically correct. We don't know his intent. The problem here is, maybe it's not fine because there could be some premeditation involved. So maybe I would deny that motion too, actually, now that I think about it, because what was going on with Stephan Sterns that Saturday prior to Maddie's birthday party? Why was he freaking out? Why was she sad? Was something happening? If he had gotten her in trouble, so to speak, did he premeditate, oh, I better get rid of this girl before anyone finds out my secret, how I've been damaging her? Well, then that would show intent. Then you could use whatever word you want there. To me, that's kind of apples and oranges, but I think I would deny that motion too. Boy, they really get deep in here. The next, defendant's motion to strike the death penalty as a possible penalty because it would violate Stephan's fundamental right to life. Now, this is where I was surprised that they really dig into Christianity here. The Catholic Church and many evangelical Christians have voiced opposition to the death penalty, and they start talking about the Pope Francis saying the death penalty is inadmissible because human life is always sacred in the eyes of the Creator. Now, I do agree that God views human life as sacred. I do. But to me, let's not let the sacred life of Madeline Soto get lost in all of this, I don't want to call it jailhouse religion. You know, Stephan Sterns was all on Reddit talking about religion is whatever. He had stuff to say about religion. So that's why I was so surprised to see on his intake form him calling himself a Christian. And I'm like, oh, now you're Christian. You know, you've done all this stuff to harm this little girl. And I'm not saying anyone can't repent. Of course, you guys know I do prison ministry. I go in there. I plan to maybe go next week and talk to people about turning their lives over to Christ. So I'm not saying things are impossible, but I'm saying, I don't know, it kind of trips me out when people start using quote unquote religion, and Jesus was not about religion. He came against the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the hypocritical religious leaders of his day. Jesus could clap back at them. What did he call them? Whitewashed men, tombs full of old men's bones. Jesus could clap back at some people. So they're pulling up the holy letter of this Holy Father Francis and referencing in the New Testament while individuals are asked not to take justice into their own hands. There's also a recognition of the need for authorities to impose penalties on evildoers. They have all these references. They reference Romans 12:17. I was like, I gotta look up these references and see what they're talking about. Romans 12:17 rather says, do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. I always thought that was Romans 12:21 says something like that. Don't repay evil for evil. That's it. Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I always think of that as 12, and then 21's the reverse. So don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So they're saying, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. It goes on to say, don't take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. So I get what they're saying here, trying to kind of pull at our heartstrings. And they're saying, okay, Romans 13:4, there's also recognition for authorities to impose. There's also a recognition for the need of authorities to impose penalties on evildoers. So Romans 13:4 says, for he is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. I don't know if that would be very helpful in terms of, I'm thinking of me like a Christian. If I lived in Florida, if I so happen to have ended up on Stephan Sterns' jury, I know no matter whose jury I would ever end up on, I would give really careful thought, especially on imposing a death penalty. I know it's easy to sit here in my bedroom and say, oh yeah, I'd vote for him to be put to death, or oh no, I wouldn't. I really don't know. I've never sat on a jury, and so I know I would want to be a cautious, careful, fair, and just jury member. I'd want to pay attention to all the evidence and then pray and really select the proper verdict. according to the law, not based all on emotions and everything. So they also are referencing 1 Peter 2:14, which says, before that, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors as those sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. So that's kind of saying, look, give deference to the judge and the laws of your land, the people above you, they're making these laws. Take that into consideration. So they quoted a lot more Christian writings and historical writings. It says, wherefore the defendant Sterns basically respectfully seeks this honorable court strike the death penalty as a possible penalty in this matter. No, I don't think they have to strike it. I don't think that's going to fly. Now, whether or not Sterns will get sentenced to death is a whole nother matter. But I tell you what, for me to sentence anyone to death as a jury member, or even being in the position of a judge, deciding whether to take it off the table or not, based on, is Sterns going to give up some more info or plea or something? What would he have to do to get the death penalty off the table? That's a hard row to hoe. I'm not going to lie. I would have to give it a tremendous amount of thought, because when you feel like, oh my goodness, someone's soul is in my hands. And to me, especially if the person isn't a believer, and I believe people who are in Christ go to heaven, and those who aren't a believer, what if Sterns really isn't a believer? And so that would be me sentencing him to hell. And that's, in my opinion, that's something I wouldn't take lightly. In spite of everything he's done, I wouldn't just, how people just write, rot in hell, burn in hell. And maybe some of them really, really, truly mean it. With me, I'd have to really say, okay, is that what I'm really voting for? And maybe it would be. Now, there's other motions to record victim impact evidence. It's a little weird. They reference this other case, a death penalty case, where a witness made an emotional outburst on the stand during her testimony. Yeah, I could see that happening in cases. It's a death penalty case. The defendant's motion for a mistrial was denied. Upon review, the court said that because it was unable to, quote, glean from the record how intense the witness's outburst was at trial, the court had to defer to the trial court's ruling on the intensity and impact of the outburst. Makes sense. Everything needs to be on video, in my opinion, so I would totally agree with this motion. Sure, video record all the victim impact evidence you want. Some of these things I think are going to backfire on the defense. Of course, emotional outbursts during victim impact statements. I think of the woman who had that big outburst during Jeffrey Dahmer's, I believe it must have been the sentencing phase. And she's like, I hate you, Jeffrey. We've all seen it. And she's running over to him and the bailiffs are, controlling her. So in Sterns' case, it says, similarly, there is a high likelihood of intense emotion during the presentation of victim impact evidence. As such, a video recording of the testimony is the best evidence that can be produced in order to have meaningful appellate review. I get it. I would approve definitely this if I were the judge. Everything on video is good because, yeah, you can't just read writing. That's why I want the pre-trial hearing, all the coverage on film, allowed to be broadcast everywhere. Because something in writing saying, oh, this person had an emotional outburst, that tells us nothing. But to see, for example, the woman who's like, I hate you, Jeffrey, and the way she screamed and she shook and she ran over to him and everything, that tells us a lot more. Video and audio is everything. Just writing is kind of like, okay, depending on, you trying to describe something, it's not meaningful. Of course, they want it to have as evidence for if he does get convicted and on appeal, they want to be able to say, here's this evidence, and for whatever reason, they want to say, oh, for this reason, maybe he should win his appeal, even though it probably won't work, but fine, put everything on video. Now, this was interesting. Stephan Sterns' lawyers want the presentation of victim impact statements to be presented only at the Spencer hearing. Only at the Spencer hearing should one be necessary. It says because victim impact statements are inevitably and inherently extremely emotional, as they should be, and have a high probability of unduly, unfairly, and unconstitutionally prejudicing and inflaming the jury. Well, I don't agree with that. If a person is upset, perhaps you hear the ice storm coming. I hear the rain against my window. Ice storm in the Midwest. If a person is very upset, okay, let's say Maddie's grandmother, Yolanda, gives an impact statement, or her granddad, Juan, and of course they would break into tears. First of all, Stephan Sterns' defense attorney doesn't even want them reading their own impact statements. Another one we'll get to, which I think should be banished. Anyway, of course you're going to get emotional if Juan, for example, starts crying and saying, I remember all the time I spent with Maddie and I helped her learn how to ride her bike and I hate you, Sterns, and that kind of stuff is natural. Will it unconstitutionally inflame the jury? No, it'll put them in his shoes for a minute to say, look how much this accused person took away from this family. Look at this life he's accused of taking. Look at the impact. I mean, that's the reason they're there. But they're saying, as such, allowing the jury to hear prior to rendering a verdict on the penalty any such statements violates a defendant's rights to a fair trial and due process. This whole Spencer hearing thing was new to me. Of course, I had to Google it. According to this online paralegal degree website.org, it's saying Spencer hearings are a relatively recent legal innovation. It's emerged in Florida, in the Florida criminal system. Florida's always doing wild stuff, aren't they? Since the state Supreme Court's ruling regarding a case in 1993. Essentially, these hearings give defendants an opportunity to provide additional evidence to change the penalties imposed by sentencing. And the prosecution also participates in the hearing and may also exhibit evidence to support the penalties initially imposed by the jury's decision. So I'm like, what's the big difference in a Spencer hearing? I don't know. Maybe they just want it broken out. I was thinking, could a Spencer hearing be more secretive, or what's the point? What's the advantage? But it traces back to this case of Spencer versus Florida, where the defendant in the case was accused and convicted of the first-degree murder of his wife, in addition to aggravated assault and other felony charges. Okay, so Spencer opposed the jury's initial conviction, carrying the weight of the death penalty, claiming that inappropriate aggravating circumstances were considered during the trial. I wonder which ones. So he appealed the court's decision to the Florida Supreme Court, which remanded the case back to the judge to reconsider the application of the death penalty. Spencer and his attorneys used the hearing to present several arguments to prove significant mitigating circumstances, including, this is what I thought Sterns is going to use, including the influence of a mental disturbance and the inability to understand the morality of his own actions at the time. While the judge overseeing the hearing ultimately confirmed the decision of the jury, it still set a precedence for future cases. So I get it. Okay, fine, have your Spencer hearing. It didn't work for Mr. Spencer, who was convicted apparently of murdering his wife, and he still got the death penalty. But I think they're going to play around with that. Okay, these mitigating circumstances, like we've already seen, Stephan has a TBI, and he didn't know right from wrong. He has a mental disturbance. He didn't understand the morality of what he did to Maddie. I'm not going to cuss right here, but it makes me want to. So I don't think that'll work. I mean, they can approve it. Fine, give this man his Spencer hearing. That doesn't mean he'll get the death penalty thrown out. Then there's this motion for victim impact statements to be read by a neutral party. I would be like, no, I'd turn this one down. A victim impact statement is not an aggravating factor, and the jury should be so instructed. Even with such an instruction, having a neutral party read the victim impact statements can further minimize the potential for the emotional nature of these statements to improperly influence the jury. Nope, if I were the judge in this case, I would strike this down. The only time a neutral party, in my opinion, should be reading a victim impact statement is if that person chooses, if they're too upset. In the case of Shanann Watts, Chris Watts was convicted of horribly getting rid of his wife, Shanann. She was 15 weeks pregnant, and their daughters, Bella and Celeste, in the worst way. Well, Shanann's brother, Frankie, got up there, and he was obviously very upset. He had someone else read his victim impact statement, whereas Shanann's mom, she read her own. And to me, that was her right. Anyone impacted, let's say Maddie's grandma, Yolanda, chooses to read a victim impact statement, it is her right to read it. I feel like a person has lost someone, especially to a violent crime, if they were to be told you can't even read your own victim impact statement. To me, that's an insult. So let's hope the judge strikes this one down. This one's weird to me. There's a motion to preclude the state from using peremptory? Peremptory? That seems wrong.
Peremptory.
Peremptory. From using peremptory, it's spelled right, especially of a person's manner or actions, insisting on immediate attention or obedience, especially in a brusquely imperious way. Or in the law, it means not open to appeal or challenge. Final. So a motion to preclude the state from using final challenges to exclude potential jurors on the basis of their race. So they go into 100 years ago, this Plessy versus Ferguson case. It was the law, and under Plessy, the prosecutors of this state could get away with removing any black person who might have appeared on the jury. Now, of course, this one should be thumbs up, approved. Don't exclude any juror strictly on the basis of race. But it's weird how they threw it in there. I thought someone was reading where they threw it in there because sometimes juries tend to look at white victims as more valuable, and so they'd be more willing to find Stephan guilty and see him sentenced to the death penalty than if Maddie were a minority. I think that's the logic here. No matter their logic, this is one I think will backfire. The judge approves it, fine. No one can just through the voir dire process, you can't get rid of you just because you're whatever race. But I think it'll backfire because if a person of color like me made it on the Stephan Sterns' jury, I'm not going to give him an easier time or something like that. I wouldn't have done it in the O.J. Simpson case. Believe me, I get into arguments about this. Again, I look at the color of justice. It's not about the color of the victim, the color of the perpetrator, whatever. It's more about what are the facts, what happened, what's right, and what's wrong. And so I think this is another one that could backfire if I don't even know if this is the logic, but if they're thinking getting a person of color on the jury would help them somehow, I don't think it would work. Whatever the thought process is. This one, another angering, infuriating one. Motion to exclude evidence or argument designed to create sympathy for the deceased or vilify Mr. Sterns. No, don't exclude any evidence or arguments designed to create sympathy for Maddie, because Maddie, of course, she's going to have sympathy from us. She was only 13. This man was given free rein to harm her, I believe, since she was at least 8 years old or younger. Of course we're going to be sympathetic. I get it. A jury trial is a show. I'm sorry, it is. The lawyers who put on the best show oftentimes emotionally connect with the jury, get their message across. Sometimes that's when they win. That's what it was about in the O.J. Simpson trial. Some of those lawyers I can't stand, but some of them I'm like, well, you are doing your job. You're doing the whole, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And the whole base level, 8th grade level type of understanding where it's like, yeah, people, obviously, they got on with that. Never mind the victims laying in a river of blood, nearly decapitated. How can people forget about the victims? That's what I'm saying. Well, if the defense can put on such a show in a trial like OJ's, let the prosecutors put on their show too to see, look, yes, create sympathy for Maddie. Show that video of her, that last video of her walking into the sunset. You don't have to vilify Stephan any more than he's vilified himself. So I know they don't want, oh, this beautiful montage of Maddie playing. So what? I mean, they did it, I believe, in Stauch's case. Letitia Stauch, the evil stepmother, she vilified herself enough. She looked like evil incarnate. Even before she was extradited from Myrtle Beach, she was arrested. I mean, her eyes were rolling around in her head. It made my blood run cold watching that video of that woman. I can't watch it. And Gannon was a little boy, and they just played his photos, and rightly so, in court, because that's who he was. He was a sympathetic character. He was a child. Maddie was a child who should have lived. So they're saying this type of evidence, along with evidence designed to vilify the defendant, is offered only to inflame the passions and emotions of the jury and encourage a jury to make findings and decisions based on emotion rather than a logical evaluation of the evidence. They are not mutually exclusive things. You can be emotional and you can be logical. So I can be emotional that Maddie lost her life and that's sad. And I can also view all the evidence. Stephan's, resetting his phone accidentally, and this whole Maddie folder on Google he had, and, all the evidence they found, logically say, yes, this man beyond a reasonable doubt is guilty. I'm just saying, if I were a juror looking at all the evidence and figuring out what else happened that Sunday night that we don't know yet, if I came to that conclusion, I could logically come to that conclusion and also be angry. Not to the point where I'm disrupting the courtroom, but you know what I mean? I can have emotions. It's nothing wrong with crying, having emotions, feeling sorry for a victim. So yeah, this should be struck down. I think the prosecutors should be able to put up whatever they want to show what a great girl Maddie was. They're saying, take as an instance the subject of a victim's character. They're talking about, is it relevant that the deceased person was a good person? Oh, they go all into it. Does having a victim with bad character somehow become a mitigating circumstance? I understand what they're saying, but it's just going too far. Those are the main strokes of these motions, the ones that really stuck out to me. There's a lot of other boring stuff in there where it's like, yeah, whatever, maybe that's standard. Of course, you're going to try, like they say, throw spaghetti against the wall, but I thought it'd be a good exercise for us to dig into some of them and see what we would approve, to see which motions we would approve and which ones we would deny. So I hope the judge has a lot of time to go through these and we'll start seeing the results, which ones are denied, which ones are approved. Now let's talk about this Stephan Sterns' friend's interview, which I'm saying is missing, Chase Leonard. Why is this missing? There are interviews with Chase Leonard. One is on J is for Justice. One is on Gray Hughes Investigates. I've linked to them both below. One was nearly 3 hours long. They were very insightful, but it was weird to me that these were conducted by YouTubers. Granted, I'm grateful that Chase felt comfortable enough after this happened. This was back in March, these interviews happened, where he wanted to talk. He wanted to say what he knew about Stephan. It's good the YouTubers got the interviews, but I was like, why didn't Chase talk to police? Did police not reach out to Chase? And I requested the police interviews with Chase because naturally I assumed, okay, they must have talked to him. He's a longtime friend of Sterns, but the Orange County Sheriff's Office told me last week they have reviewed their files and they have determined no responsive records. Kissimmee told me we do not have an interview for Chase Leonard. If you want to watch those interviews and listen to them, find the links below. But Chase goes way back with Stephan Sterns. First of all, I saw, if you Google Stephan Sterns' old MySpace page, you can tell Chase Leonard was like probably one of his top 8. You remember those top 8 on MySpace? And so I know he was a valid friend there. And Chris Sterns and Deborah Sterns, Stephan's parents, even talked about Chase. Chris talked about not liking Stephan's friends who weren't like the upper crust type of associates that, Chris had when he was growing up. He was like mentioning some families as if that was supposed to impress the police, I guess. But they do mention Chase Leonard. Deborah spoke of Chase during her portion of the interview where she allowed Stephan to get a tattoo of that coat of arms, family crest or whatever on his back right shoulder. She talked Stephan out of getting some stupid brand of Friends Club numbers, 521, whatever she said it was. I think she said that might have been Chase's idea. And she went on to say Stephan was attracted to big boobs and said they didn't know anything about any inappropriate relationships that Stephan may have engaged in. But this is the point where Deb was talking about. He didn't date, he had hookups. And so Deb was blaming like the girls around Stephan for being the aggressors. But at this point, this is when she says, Chase called into that awful website, Grady Hughes Investigates. And she says, I'm being flayed. And what I found was interesting was that Deb did not get into the context of what Chase was saying about Stephan. Instead, she's just like focused on herself. I'm being flayed. But Chase had such interesting things to say. I was really hoping the cops would interview him. This is what he revealed on YouTube. He talked about Stephan's grandfather dying and leaving him an inheritance of $80,000 to $100,000. So I was like, oh, that's what Chris Sterns was referencing. He talked about Stephan having the older brother, Rick, who Chase didn't even know existed for 2 years. Now, Chase hadn't even seen Stephan's brother Rick during the holidays or anything. So for some reason, Rick stays away from this family, I think. Something must have gone on there. Chase was very, very close with Stephan and his family. He spent plenty of time with Stephan, even if he hasn't seen Stephan in about 10 years since they were in their 20s. I thought, okay, maybe that's why police did not interview Chase. Maybe they thought he doesn't have any relevant, pertinent information for Stephan, the recent happenings. But I still think he could be great as some kind of character witness to establish Stephan's creepy pattern of spying on people since before Maddie. But Chase finally ended his friendship with Stephan when Stephan threatened him with a weapon because Chase refused to keep paying rent because whatever leased space he was in, I think his dad must have owned it. I think Stephan's dad must have owned it. And Stephan's dad was on Stephan to get Chase to pay a share. And Chase was like, no, if the stuff is, not going to be repaired. So that's when it ended. I think that could be pertinent too, because Chase could say, look, this is how Stephan flips out when he doesn't get his way. He talks about Stephan being a grown man still falling out on the floor and kicking his feet. When Chase started refusing to pay his share of the rent, the lease, Stephan went and got a gun and threatened his life. Now, I think this is very relevant as to how Stephan reacts in situations where he's not getting his way. Was he not getting his way with Maddie that Sunday night, and did he use his own arm as a weapon to strangle her? That's my question. Now, Chase moved from Japan when he was around 17. He became very close friends with Stephan, but it was Stephan's literal penchant to drop down on the floor, throw a literal tantrum, kick and scream when he didn't get his way. After that, and after he was threatened with the gun, Chase blocked Stephan everywhere. Chase's mom didn't even like Stephan, but Chase says we were basically like brothers. We lived together. I lived with him in 4 different homes. So this guy has some experience with Stephan. Chase knew of instances, this is what he says, where one of Stephan's roommates discovered that Stephan had been secretly taking photos, perhaps videos too, of the roommate's girlfriend of 5 years. So Stephan had this roommate, and this roommate had a girlfriend of 5 years, and Stephan was caught. This roommate was an IT guy, and he said he saw a folder that Stephan had containing the roommate's girlfriend's photos. So ding ding ding, rings a bell like he did with Maddie. And this IT guy also found a folder of, quote, young girls, not sure how young. I don't know if he looked in there. I think Chase was assuming, oh, does young girls mean college girls or what? And Chase, this is the important part, Chase alluded to accusations that Stephan's mom may have paid off someone to get Stephan out of that situation. Now, it doesn't sound like he knows for sure. Those are Chase's allegations, not mine. And of course, Deborah, I believe she's denied all of this. But Chase called Deb Sterns very racist, cruel, evil, and mean. The most damning accusation was her paying off their friend. That guy who was the IT guy, whoever he is, I wish cops could interview him, who moved in with Stephan after Chase no longer lived with Stephan, and discovered, according to Chase, Stephan had been hiding a camera that captured that IT guy's girlfriend getting in and out of the shower. Sound familiar? Same thing he did to Angelica. Now, I know her deposition is coming up, so she'll be able to talk to police, and we've gotten her interviews. So I'm like, where's Chase's interview? Chase said he advised his friend to just take the money and report Stephan. So Chase is saying, look, this IT guy got some money or was offered money from Deb, but did anyone ever report Stephan? That's what Chase was asking himself. If he could have been brought up on charges way back then, perhaps Maddie would have been spared a lot of trauma. Maybe Stephan could have been off in jail. Jennifer couldn't have even met him and had him around Maddie. Chase lived with Stephan and his mom and dad during several years, so he had plenty of insight into their family. He knew about the lifted truck that ran over Stephan and caused his TBI, causing Stephan to have this long-lasting fear of lifted trucks. So the accident happened when Stephan lived in Georgia, but the lawsuit we talked about took place in Sarasota County. Chase knew Stephan was weird, but he could never foresee Stephan ever committing a murder or CSAM or anything. But at the same token, Chase said that Stephan only fought back in his life when some 40-year-old drunk guy allegedly was catcalling Stephan's girlfriend. I think this was in California, and Stephan flipped the guy off, and the guy came back and pummeled Stephan, and Stephan allegedly pulled a knife out on this man, perhaps even stabbed him according to Chase, and Stephan suffered from anxiety after that episode. And I'm asking, is that why the family left California? Chase spoke of Stephan's dad being just checked out. Chris was checked out, not around much, acting like a man who hated his family, Chase said. Chase said they joked that Stephan's dad might have another family. Chase didn't have many nice things to say about Stephan's mom, Deborah, calling her a woman who really got into screaming matches with Stephan, but still did everything for him. And then remember, Deborah, as a result, talked to police after listening to this interview and saying, "I don't scream, I yell. You know, I have this Irish temper." Chase said Stephan grew up with maids and didn't know how to do many things. Chase had to teach him how to use a washer and dryer and a microwave. He said Stephan's parents' wealth changed and it sank over the years. They used to have a really nice home. Again, go listen over there to all the details. It's a lot more than I'm saying. Chase admits he has had his own run-ins with police, but nothing like Stephan's issues. So I'm like, did cops ever contact him or what? And they're talking about some Rick Armstrong guy. I don't know. Is he some kind of guy that Stephan knows? I don't know. So check all those links below. And let's close with Revelation 14:13. Then I heard the distinct words of a voice from heaven saying, "Write, blessed, happy, prosperous, to be admired are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, blessed indeed, says the Spirit, so that they may rest and have relief from their labors, for their deeds do follow them." And that's my prayer for little Maddie, that she's just at rest in heaven doing whatever gives her joy, brings her joy, as we get to witness her justice down here on earth. Despite all of these crazy motions, which of course criminal defense attorneys have to put in. I have nothing against criminal defense attorneys. Some of them do their jobs in more tactful ways than others. Everyone hates criminal defense attorneys, I always say, until you need one. So if you need one, believe me, you won't hate one then. So I understand. I give them plenty of grace. They have to do their job. However, some people do it in more tactless ways than others. We'll see what these motions bring about from the judge. I hope the judge is able to easily read through and, come to a great conclusion and get these motions either approved or denied in part or in full, so that this case can keep progressing. So what do you think about all the motions? What do you think about Chase Leonard's interviews and why we haven't seen one with police? I think what he says is very valuable. Not that he was there that night. Many people weren't there that night in the condo when Maddie lost her life, but that doesn't preclude them from having valuable information about how Stephan acted in the past. I don't know what would actually be admissible in court, but I think it could help a jury see and establish a pattern of how Stephan Sterns acts in certain circumstances to help them make such a heavy decision. It is a heavy decision, I won't lie. I wouldn't be flippant with this case. I wouldn't just be like, "I'll go rot in hell, go burn in hell." No, you'd have to logically understand the reasons of why you believe he truly did take Maddie's life. And there's so much we just still don't know, beyond a preponderance of the evidence, beyond all reasonable doubt, following the law and convicting this man if God says so. Thanks for watching all this. Stay tuned. I'm still covering this case and many more. Take care.